The alarm screamed at 4:45 a.m., a sound that felt less like a call to action and more like a physical assault on the nervous system. My hand found the button in the dark, silencing it with a practiced slap. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by Leo's muffled groan from the other side of the dorm room and the distant hum of a campus that was still asleep. "I hate you," he mumbled into his pillow. "You hate the uniform," I corrected, my voice gravel. "You're ambivalent toward me." "Semantics, it's too early for your brain to be working." But it always was. In the pitch black, before my feet even hit the cold linoleum, the mental checklist began: PT uniform, socks, boots, course readings for Finch's seminar, the outline for my paper on Hobbes due Friday, remember to call Mom. The list was a cage, but it was my cage. I built it, and I found a strange comfort in its rigid bars. By 5:15, we were on the field behind the athletic complex, a line of shivering silhouettes against the bruised pre-dawn sky. The air smelled of damp earth and cut grass, a clean, sharp scent that was already giving way to the warmer odor of sweat and effort. Captain Sophia Reyes stood before us, a compact figure radiating an energy that made the early hour irrelevant. Her eyes, even in the low light, missed nothing. "Good morning, cadets," she said, her voice carrying without being a shout. It was a statement, not a greeting. "Today, we remember that discomfort is a choice. Your body will complain. Your mind will invent excellent reasons to quit. Your job is to acknowledge those inputs and then disregard them. Let's run." We ran. We did push-ups in the dew-soaked grass. We hauled each other through a makeshift obstacle course. Leo, beside me, was breathing hard but steady. "You know," he gasped as we low-crawled under a mesh of ropes, "in a past life I was probably a very lazy house cat. This feels like a karmic correction." I grunted, focusing on keeping my back low, the gritty soil cool against my forearms. This was the other checklist: form, breathing, pace. The pure, physical calculus of it was a relief. There was a right way and a wrong way. Effort yielded visible results. It was nothing like the shifting, opinion-laden sands of political theory 401. After PT, we had exactly 22 minutes to get across campus, shower, change, and be in our seats in Finch's hallowed seminar room. It was a Tuesday ritual, a twice-weekly gauntlet of logistics. "Stairwell?" Leo asked, already shrugging off his damp PT shirt as we jogged toward the social sciences building. "Stairwell," I confirmed. We burst through a side door and into the sterile, echoey concrete stairwell of Mason Hall. It was deserted, smelling of industrial cleaner and old books. We dumped our backpacks, our movements frantic and synchronized. Off came the sweat-stained shirts and shorts, on went the pressed khakis and the collared shirt. I yanked my ROTC uniform jacket from my bag, the dark green wool crisp and heavy. I hesitated for a half-second, my fingers on the brass buttons. Wearing it to Finch's class always felt like walking in with a target painted on my back. But regulations were regulations for ROTC students in military science classes, and Tuesdays were uniform days. It was non-negotiable. "You good?" Leo asked, already looking presentable, his own uniform jacket slung over his arm. He was pre-med. His battles were with organic chemistry, not professors with Ivy League pedigrees. "Fine," I said, buttoning the jacket. The weight of it settled on my shoulders, familiar and burdensome all at once. We slipped into the seminar room with 90 seconds to spare. The room was all dark wood and leather, smelling of lemon oil and ambition. It was packed, as always. Professor Alastair Finch sat at the head of the long oval table, a man perfectly suited to his surroundings. At 62, he had a patrician handsomeness, silver hair swept back from a high forehead, eyes the color of flint behind thin-framed glasses. He was reviewing his notes, a fountain pen in hand, the very picture of considered intellectualism. I took my usual seat, midway down the table. Leo, who was in this class as an elective and seemed to genuinely enjoy poking the bear, sat across from me. To my right was Maya Thorne. She gave me a small, distracted smile as I sat, her gaze lingering for a microsecond on my uniform jacket before darting back to her heavily annotated copy of Rousseau's The Social Contract. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, a strand of dark hair escaping from her messy bun. She was brilliant in a quiet, ferocious way, the kind of student who asked questions that weren't designed to show off her knowledge, but to genuinely dismantle a concept to see how it worked. "Good morning," Finch began, setting down his pen. His voice was a dry, precise instrument. "Today, we continue our discussion of civic virtue and its modern permutations, specifically the concept of the citizen soldier, an idealistic notion born of the Athenian hoplite and romanticized by the American founders. Mr. Jameson," he said, his eyes finding me without seeming to search. "As you are affiliated with the contemporary iteration of this concept, perhaps you could start us off. What is the relevance of the citizen soldier ideal in an age of professional, all-volunteer forces and asymmetric warfare?" All eyes turned to me. I could feel the heat at the back of my neck. This was Finch's preferred method, cold calling, then picking apart the response with surgical disdain. I took a breath, organizing my thoughts. I'd done the reading. I'd written a response paper on it. "The relevance isn't in the structure, Professor, but in the principle," I started, keeping my voice even. "The idea that the defender of the state is not a separate warrior class, but is invested in the society he or she protects. It's a check on militarism. A professional soldier can be loyal to the institution of the military. A citizen soldier, in theory, is loyal first to the Constitution and the citizenry." Finch gave a slow, deliberate nod that felt more ominous than encouraging. "A tidy textbook answer, Mr. Jameson. Loyalty to an abstraction, a constitution. And how does one cultivate the cognitive faculties to understand, let alone defend, such abstractions? Through the rigorous, dispassionate pursuit of knowledge, or through regimented training?" He said the last two words as if describing a particularly crude form of animal husbandry. A few students shifted in their seats. Maya had stopped writing and was watching Finch, her head tilted. "I believe they can be complementary," I said, the words feeling stiff. "Strategic thinking requires both theoretical understanding and practical application." Ah, strategic thinking. A term beloved by institutions that prioritize doctrine over doubt. Finch removed his glasses and began to clean them with a linen handkerchief. He was now addressing the whole class, using me as a prop. "This is the fundamental flaw in conflating military training with higher education. The former demands conformity, obedience, the subjugation of individual critical thought to a chain of command. The latter, true education, demands the exact opposite. Skepticism, deconstruction, the courage to question every assumption, especially one's own. To believe that the same mind can be trained to excel at both is, at best, optimistic. At worst, it is a dangerous dilution of academic rigor." The room was very quiet. I could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. My face was hot. I kept my posture straight, my hands flat on the table in front of me. "Programs like ROTC," Finch continued, his voice dropping into a confidential, almost pitying tone that was worse than any shout, "are institutional crutches. Well-meaning, perhaps, but crutches nonetheless. They offer structure and guaranteed employment for those who might otherwise struggle with the cognitive load and intellectual ambiguity of a real college education. They confuse discipline for intellect, obedience for wisdom." It felt like all the air had been sucked from the room. The words cognitive load seemed to hang in the space above the table, toxic and heavy. He wasn't just criticizing an idea, he was diagnosing me, and everyone like me, with a congenital intellectual deficiency. My mind, usually a whirlwind of analysis, went blank and white with a kind of furious shame. I was aware of every thread in my uniform jacket, every brass button feeling like a badge of stupidity. I saw Leo's jaw tighten from across the table. Maya was looking down at her book, but her cheeks were flushed. Was it with embarrassment for me, or agreement with him? I didn't raise my hand. I didn't object. I just sat there, paralyzed, as Finch smoothly transitioned back to Thucydides, leaving me dissected on the table for the remainder of the hour. The bell finally rang, a sharp, merciful sound. Students gathered their things in a rustle of paper and murmured conversation. I moved slowly, mechanically. "Carter, man, that was," Leo began, falling into step beside me as we left the room. "Forget it," I interrupted, my voice tighter than I intended. "Forget it. He basically called you a trained monkey with a textbook." "I know what he said, Leo." Maya caught up to us just outside the door. She looked between us, her expression conflicted. "That was pretty harsh," she said quietly. "It's fine," I said again, the lie automatic. "It's not fine," she insisted. His conflation of intellectual independence with anti-authoritarianism is simplistic. The military isn't a monolith. There's a difference between blind obedience and disciplined execution of a complex strategy. She was thinking out loud, working through the problem philosophically. It was her way of offering solidarity, but it felt abstract, like I was a case study. "Thanks, Maya," I said, not wanting to be a case study. I just wanted to be invisible for a while. She nodded, understanding she'd hit a limit. "See you Thursday." I spent the rest of the day in a haze of anger and humiliation. The words replayed in my head, each repetition layering on a new shade of meaning, a deeper cut. Cognitive load, institutional crutches, real college education. They mingled with the other, older doubts that were my constant companions. The feeling of being an imposter in these hallways, the fear that my acceptance letter had been a mistake, that my hard-won discipline was just a fancy kind of stubbornness, masking a fundamental lack of brilliance. Finch had given those fears a voice, an intellectual justification. That was the true injury. He hadn't just insulted me, he'd validated my deepest anxiety. My afternoon classes were a blur. I went through the motions in my engineering lecture, took notes I knew I wouldn't be able to decipher later. All I could feel was the burn, a coal of shame and fury sitting in my gut. It needed direction. It needed an outlet. After my last class, I went to the ROTC building, a modest brick structure that felt like a sanctuary. I found Captain Ray's in her office, which was a model of controlled efficiency. Books on military history and aeronautical engineering lined the shelves, a detailed map of some mountainous region was pinned to one wall, and her flight helmet sat on a stand in the corner like a modern sculpture. She was typing at her computer, her posture perfect even in solitude. "Cadet Jameson," she said without looking up, "close the door." I did. The click of the latch felt final. "Sid." I sat in the chair opposite her desk. She finished typing, turned her screen slightly away, and finally looked at me. Her dark eyes were assessing, missing nothing, the rigid set of my shoulders, the tension in my jaw, the way my fingers were clenched together in my lap. "You look like you've swallowed a live wire," she observed, her tone neutral. "Professor Finch," I said, the name like a curse. I gave her a clipped, clinical summary of the seminar, repeating his words as dispassionately as I could manage. It still felt like pouring salt on a wound. When I finished, I waited for her outrage, for the comforting assurance that he was a pompous fool, for some shared indignation. Captain Ray's leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. She was silent for a long moment. "And?" she finally asked. The question threw me, and it was insulting, demeaning, not just to me but to the program, to the idea of service. "It was," she agreed calmly. "So what?" "So," I floundered, "so he's wrong." "Prove it." I blinked. "What?" "Prove him wrong." She leaned forward, her elbows on the desk. "You want to stand there in your uniform and fume? That just confirms his bias. You want to complain to me for sympathy? That's a waste of both our time. You want to change his mind, or at least shut him up, you have to beat him on his own turf. You have to outthink him." The coal in my gut flared, finding the oxygen it needed. How? She reached for a notepad, scribbled something, and tore off the sheet. She slid it across the desk to me. "This is the title of your next independent study project. A research paper. 40 pages, minimum. Scholarly sources, primary documents. I want a draft in 2 weeks." I looked down at the paper. In her precise, blocky handwriting, it read, "On war is not an abstract. A critical analysis of the application of Clausewitzian theory to U.S. counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan, 2001-2014. I stared at it. Clausewitz, the 19th century Prussian military theorist we touched on in Finch's class just last week. Finch had dismissed him as a relic of state-on-state warfare, irrelevant in the postmodern geopolitical landscape. It was a direct challenge, a gauntlet thrown back in Finch's direction through me. 2 weeks, I managed to say. On top of my existing course load, PT, and other ROTC requirements, it was a brutal ask. "You're balancing a double major and a commission," Reyes said, a hint of a challenge in her own voice now. "You want to be a Rhodes scholar and an Apache pilot. You think either of those paths is paved with free time and gentle deadlines? This," she tapped the paper, "is the work. This is how you prove him wrong. Not with a clever retort in a seminar, with research, with analysis, with a deeper, better understanding of the very theories he claims you're incapable of grasping. You show him that this uniform, she gestured at my jacket, doesn't preclude what's underneath. It demands more of it. The fury was still there, but it was changing, cooling from a hot rage into something harder, denser, more useful. It was becoming fuel. I looked from the paper to her unwavering gaze. There was no sympathy there, only expectation. She wasn't offering a balm, she was handing me a weapon and pointing me at the enemy. "Yes, Captain," I said, my voice firm for the first time since that seminar room. "Dismissed, Cadet." I stood, folded the paper, and placed it carefully in the inner pocket of my uniform jacket, right over my heart. The weight of it felt good. It was a different kind of weight. As I left her office and walked out into the crisp autumn evening, the shame began to recede, replaced by a singular, focused pressure. Finch saw a crutch. Reyes saw a crucible. And for the first time that day, I felt a spark of something that wasn't doubt. It was colder, sharper. It was resolve. He wanted a philosophical debate about the citizen soldier? Fine, I would give him a war. A paper war, fought in footnotes and bibliographies, and I would bury his assumptions under a mountain of evidence he couldn't ignore. The gauntlet had been thrown. Now, I had to learn how to fight on his terrain without becoming what he despised. The coal of anger was now a forge fire, and I had 2 weeks to temper myself in its heat. The paper felt heavier in my hands than it should have, the weight of 16 months distilled into 12 carefully argued pages. The seminar room smelled of old books and lemon polish, the same scent that had permeated every one of Professor Finch's classes for the past 2 years. I'd chosen my seat deliberately today, not in the back where I usually observed, but at the center of the U-shaped table, directly in his line of sight. "Mr. Jameson," Finch said, his voice a dry rustle of parchment, "I believe you're presenting your independent study today, The Leviathan's Spear, Clausewitzian Theory in Modern Civil-Military Relations." An ambitious title. "Yes, sir." He gestured with a languid hand. "Proceed." I stood, my uniform trousers crisp against the backs of my knees. I debated wearing it today, finally deciding that if I was going to argue from the intersection of two worlds, I should look the part. Maya, seated across from me, gave a small, encouraging nod. Her skepticism had softened over months of late-night library sessions, replaced by a genuine curiosity about my dual existence. "Clausewitz wrote that war is the continuation of politics by other means," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "But in a democratic society, the other means must remain subordinate to the political will. My argument is that this subordination isn't a weakness, but the source of the military's ultimate strength and its greatest ethical challenge." For 20 minutes, I walked them through it. I wove Hobbes's Leviathan with Clausewitz's Trinity, used examples from the Roman Republic citizen soldiers to the modern all-volunteer force, and argued that the military officer's education must be as rigorous in political philosophy as in tactics. I quoted Rousseau, Machiavelli, and then Captain Reyes, paraphrasing her lesson on decision-making under extreme pressure as a form of applied moral philosophy. The room was silent when I finished. A few students looked thoughtful. One of Finch's usual acolytes, a guy named Everett who wore tweed ironically, looked vaguely nauseated. Finch steepled his fingers. "Adequate," he said, the word hanging in the air. "You've synthesized the readings with a certain practical flair. The foundational premise, however, that military service cultivates a unique form of civic virtue, remains, in my view, romantic. It assumes a level of reflection that the institution, by its very nature, discourages. An A." He slid the paper back to me. On the cover page, in his precise, spidery script, was the grade, and beneath it, "Adequate synthesis, though the foundational premise remains romantic." The sting was precise, surgical. He'd acknowledged the work, even praised its execution, while dismissing the core of what it meant to me. It was the intellectual version of a pat on the head. I sat down, the A burning in my hands. Maya caught my eye, her expression unreadable. Later, in the library stacks, the smell of dust and paper a familiar comfort, she found me. "He's threatened," she said simply, dropping her bag on the worn oak table. "By a 20-year-old ROTC cadet, doubtful." "Not by you, by the idea." She pulled out her copy of my paper, covered in her neat, marginal notes. You're arguing that the thing he dismisses as intellectually barren actually requires a deeper philosophical engagement than pure academia. You're using his tools to build something he says can't be built. Of course, he called it romantic. It's the only way to dismiss it without actually engaging the argument. I stared at her. Since when did you become my defense attorney? Since I realized he wasn't debating in good faith. She shrugged, a little embarrassed. Your last section, on the moral agency of a junior officer, I'd never considered that. The weight of a single decision under fire being a direct expression of democratic consent. It's not romantic, Carter. It's terrifyingly concrete. A warmth spread through my chest, dulling the sharp edge of Finch's critique. This was why I'd pushed through the independent study, why I'd spent nights cross-referencing flight manuals with political theory. For moments like this, where the bridge between my two worlds felt real, tangible. That bridge felt like it was splintering a week later, in the flight simulator. The ROTC building's simulator bay was a world away from the library, cold, humming with electronics, smelling of synthetic rubber and ozone. The Apache cockpit replica was cramped, a labyrinth of switches, screens, and controls. Captain Reyes stood behind my seat, her presence a physical pressure. Emergency Procedure 47 Alpha, her voice crackled in my headset. Engine fire, main rotor RPM decay. Go. My hands moved automatically, the checklist flowing through my mind. Engine fire handle pull. Fire extinguisher discharge. Affected engine shut down. The simulator shuddered, alarms blaring. The virtual landscape outside the canopy, a detailed Nevada test range tilted sickeningly. Secondary warning light. Hydraulic pressure dropping on primary system, Reyes intoned, her voice flat. A new cascade of alarms, my focus narrowed to the instruments. Switch to secondary hydraulic system, monitor rotor RPM, auto-rotation profile. I was thinking, analyzing, tracing the logic tree, but the simulator was unforgiving. The RPM decay was too rapid. I was a fraction of a second late initiating the auto-rotation. The virtual ground rushed up. Crash, Reyes said, a single terminal word. The screens went red, then blank. She yanked open the canopy door. Out. I climbed out, my flight suit clinging with a cold sweat. What was the failure point? She demanded, her dark eyes boring into me. Delayed auto-rotation initiation. I was troubleshooting the hydraulic. You were thinking about the hydraulic, she cut in. The aircraft was telling you it was dying, and you were having a philosophical debate with it. You know what happens in a real Apache when you do that? You and your co-pilot gunner become a fireball. She stepped closer, her voice dropping, but losing none of its intensity. I've read your paper, Jameson. The one Finch gave the pretty little A-. It's smart. It might even be important. But in here, she tapped my forehead, it cannot be in here when you're in there. She jerked a thumb at the simulator. Are you too busy thinking like a professor to act like a pilot? The question hit like a physical blow. It echoed Finch's dismissal, but from the opposite shore. I was either too romantic for the academy or too cerebral for the cockpit. The space in between, the identity I was trying to forge, felt like it was being crushed from both sides. No, Captain, I said, the words automatic. Prove it back in, same scenario, and this time fly the damn aircraft. The next 2 hours were a blur of simulated emergencies, engine failures, weapons system malfunctions, sudden severe weather. I stopped thinking about thinking. I let the training take over, my hands and eyes moving in a desperate practice dance. I crashed twice more, but on the 4th run, I brought a crippled Apache down to a hard, survivable landing. Reyes said nothing when I finished, just gave a short, sharp nod. It was the closest thing to approval I'd get. The strain of living on those two fronts became a constant, low-grade hum in my bones. My days were split into rigid blocks, 500 PT, classes, afternoons in the simulator or leadership labs, evenings in the library, weekends dedicated to field training exercises. I existed on coffee, protein bars, and 5-hour sleep cycles. Leo, my ever-present roommate and anchor, watched the transformation with a mix of awe and concern. One Thursday night, deep into our senior year, he and Maya commandeered a corner table in the student union. Textbooks, note cards, and empty coffee cups covered the surface. I was dissecting a particularly obtuse passage of Kierkegaard for a philosophy elective, my eyes gritty. "You look like death warmed over," Leo announced, pushing a greasy paper bag toward me. "Eat, it's a burger. It has vegetables on it, probably." I took it without argument. Flight physical tomorrow. Cholesterol is a thing. "So is collapsing from malnutrition," Maya said, not looking up from her organic chemistry textbook. She was in her pre-med grind, a mirror of my own exhaustion. "How's the Apache slot looking?" Leo asked around a mouthful of fries. "Competitive. Ray says my scores are top tier, but the board looks at everything. Academics, physical fitness, leadership eval." "Academics," Leo snorted. "You're carrying a 3.9, I think you're safe." He pointed a fry at me. "You should apply for the Rhodes." I choked on my burger. "What?" "The Rhodes Scholarship. You know Oxford? Geniuses. You're doing an independent study that's basically a thesis, you're top of your class, you've got the whole service angle. It's perfect." I laughed, a dry, tired sound. "I'm an ROTC cadet from Ohio, Leo. Rhodes scholars are there from Ivy Leagues, they have publications, they cure diseases in their spare time." Maya looked up. "That's not true, and your work is publication quality." Finch's comment proves it. He wouldn't have been that subtly vicious if it wasn't good. "She's right," Leo insisted. "What's the worst that happens? They say no, big deal, but what if they say yes? Oxford, man, think about it." I did think about it. In the quiet moments, I let myself imagine walking through Oxford's stone quads, studying civil-military relations at the source of so much political theory. It was a fantasy so distant it felt like a betrayal of the concrete path I was on, the Apache cockpit, the Army career. The two dreams seemed to exist in mutually exclusive universes. "It's a distraction," I said finally. "The selection board meets in 2 months. I need to be locked in." Leo shook his head. "You can walk and chew gum, Carter. I've seen you do it while sleep-deprived and under simulated fire." Maya closed her book. Leo's not wrong about Finch either. His bias is becoming obvious. Last week, he referred to the military as a necessary instrument of statecraft, largely devoid of intellectual agency. He was looking right at you. I noticed. "It's cheap," she said, a flicker of anger in her voice. It was new, that protective heat. "It's beneath him, and it makes your work more impressive, not less. You're operating in a system that's rigged against you in that room, and you're still winning." Her words settled something in me. The exhaustion was still there, the constant pressure, but so was a hardening resolve. Finch's disdain and Ray's brutal standards were opposite forces, and I was the material caught between them. Maybe that was the point. Maybe forging something new required being hammered from both sides. The semester rolled toward its climax. I submitted my Rhodes application, a packet that felt like a piece of my soul printed out and mailed to a committee of strangers. I threw myself into final preparations for the aviation board, spending extra hours in the simulator until the emergency procedures were muscle memory. The night before my final interview with Captain Rhodes for the flight school recommendation, I found myself back in the library. Not to study, but to think. The quiet was absolute. I traced the spines of books on political theory, then wandered to the engineering section, then to military history. Each section represented a facet of the life I was trying to build, a different language I was learning to speak. Maya found me there, as I knew she would. She didn't say anything, just fell into step beside me. "I don't know where I belong," I admitted, the words quiet in the hushed stacks. "Sometimes I feel like a tourist in both places. In Finch's seminar, I'm the soldier playing academic. In the cockpit, Ray's thinks I'm the academic playing soldier." She stopped, turning to face me. The fluorescent light glinted off her glasses. "Or," she said slowly, "you're the only one who's actually trying to be both. Everyone else has picked a side. You're trying to build a new country in the demilitarized zone. It's going to feel like you belong nowhere, because the place you're trying to belong doesn't exist yet." The truth of it resonated deep in my chest. That was exactly it. The conflict wasn't a failure of mine, it was the inherent condition of the path. What if I fail at both? The question came out before I could stop it, the deepest fear given voice. Maya smiled a little sadly. "Then you'll have failed trying to do something extraordinary. Most people never even risk that." She bumped my shoulder with hers. Now go, get some sleep. Tomorrow you have to go be extraordinary in front of Captain Rhodes. The interview was in her office. It was stark, functional. A framed picture of an Apache in flight, a bookshelf with technical manuals and a few surprising titles, Sun Tzu, Marcus Aurelius, a well-worn copy of The Right Stuff. She didn't offer me a seat. "Why do you want to fly Apache?" she asked, no preamble. "Because it's the most complex, demanding aircraft in the Army inventory. It requires technical mastery, tactical creativity, and decisive judgment under extreme pressure. It's where the intellectual and the physical meet at the highest pitch." She watched me, her expression unreadable. "And if you get the Rhodes, you delay flight school for 2 years of studying at Oxford." I'd prepared for this. "Yes, ma'am. I believe the study of political philosophy and civil-military relations at that level would make me a better officer in the long run, a more thoughtful one." A more thoughtful officer can be a slower one. In a knife fight, hesitation gets you killed. Understanding why you're in the knife fight determines whether you should be there at all, Captain. A flicker in her eyes, approval, annoyance, I couldn't tell. She asked me a dozen more questions, ethical scenarios, leadership dilemmas, technical problems. I answered as clearly as I could, the twin disciplines of seminar debate and tactical training guiding my responses. Finally, she leaned back. "You're a walking contradiction, Jameson, part philosopher, part warrior. That's either going to be your greatest strength or it's going to tear you apart. The system isn't designed for people who straddle fences. It's designed to make you pick a side." "I know, ma'am." "Do you?" She stood, ending the interview. "Your packet is strong, top third, maybe top quarter. The board decides in 4 weeks. The Rhodes Committee decides when." "Around the same time." A grim, almost smile touched her lips. "Of course they do, dismissed." Walking back across campus, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, I felt the peculiar weight of simultaneous waiting. 2 futures, both uncertain, both pulling at me. I'd done everything I could. I'd written the papers, endured the critiques, survived the simulators, forged the alliances. Now the choice wasn't mine. It was in the hands of boards and committees, people who would reduce my life to scores and essays and recommendations. For the first time in 16 months, there was no immediate task, no checklist item to attack, just the waiting. And in that quiet space, the internal conflict didn't rage. It simply existed, a fundamental tension woven into my fabric. I was no longer just a cadet or just a student. I was the argument I was trying to make, living and breathing in the space between the lines. The question wasn't which side would win. It was whether I could hold the center, and what would be born from the pressure. The air in the waiting room at the Army Aviation Support Facility smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaner, and the faint, sharp scent of anxiety. I sat ramrod straight in a plastic chair, my Class A uniform feeling more like a suit of armor than cloth. In 20 minutes, I would face the pilot selection board for the final time. The Apache slot was the prize, the culmination of 4 years of ROTC, of Captain Rhodes' relentless drilling, of 1,000 hours in simulators and textbooks. It was also the one thing I wanted that felt purely, unapologetically mine. Not a rebuttal to Professor Finch, not a proof of concept, but a calling. Leo, lounging beside me in his own dress uniform, scrolled through his phone. "Relax, Carter. You've got this. You're the only cadet who probably quoted Clausewitz in his initial application packet. They're either going to give you the bird or commit you." "Comforting," I muttered, my eyes fixed on the closed door to the boardroom. "Seriously, you're a lock. Rhodes has been prepping you for this since you could spell collective pitch. Just don't overthink it. Answer the question, shut up, move on." That was Leo's world, pragmatic, linear. Mine was a labyrinth of contingencies. I wasn't just worried about tactical knowledge, I was worried about the philosophical trap. The Apache wasn't just a helicopter, it was a weapons platform, a symbol of lethal precision and, to some, of overreach. I knew the board, a mix of seasoned aviators and senior staff officers, would probe that. They'd want to know if I understood the weight of the trigger, not just the mechanics of the gun. The door opened. A stern-faced sergeant major nodded at me. "Cadet Jameson, the board will see you now." The room was dominated by a long table. 3 colonels and a lieutenant colonel sat behind it, their faces etched with the kind of experience that comes from decades of service and hard decisions. Captain Rhodes was not present. This was not her domain. I stood at attention, reported, and took the seat offered. The questions began predictably: systems knowledge, emergency procedures, navigation scenarios. I answered crisply, my voice steady, drawing on the deep well of preparation. Then Colonel Vance, a wiry man with pilot's eyes that missed nothing, leaned forward. Cadet, scenario: you are providing close air support for a ground element in a complex urban environment. Positive identification of the hostile force is confirmed, but they have intermingled with a structure that your intelligence suggests is a protected cultural site. The ground commander is taking casualties and is requesting an immediate strike. Your rules of engagement permit it, given the confirmed hostiles. What is your course of action? It was the question I dreaded and prepared for. A purely tactical mind would see a green light. A purely academic one would see a moral quagmire and freeze. I took a breath, feeling the eyes of the room heavy upon me. Sir, the first step is acknowledgement of the dilemma. The ROTC provides a legal permission, but not an ethical absolution. I saw a flicker in Colonel Vance's eyes. My course would be immediate communication with the ground commander to assess the tactical necessity versus the proportionality of the collateral damage. I would request a confirmation that all non-lethal options are exhausted. Simultaneously, I would use my sensors to attempt to refine the target, to see if a more precise engagement is possible, even if it presents a slightly higher risk to the aircraft. The ground commander is insisting, time is critical, what do you do? I thought of Finch's sneering question about obedience. I thought of Ray's voice. A pilot who cannot think for himself is a missile, not a warrior. Sir, I am not a weapon to be fired. I am an officer in the chain of command. If, after my assessment, I believe the strike constitutes a violation of the principles of proportionality and distinction as I understand them, I am obligated to voice my objection clearly up my chain. My duty is to the mission, the law of armed conflict, and to the integrity of the service. Blind obedience in that scenario is a dereliction of the very judgment this board is selecting me to exercise. The silence was absolute. Then Colonel Vance gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. And if your objection is overruled? Then I have fulfilled my moral agency within the framework of the profession of arms, sir. The responsibility is then shared, but I would not have surrendered my conscience at the cockpit door. The rest of the questions were a blur. An hour later, I stood outside, the spring sun feeling alien on my skin. Leo was waiting, his usual grin replaced by a look of genuine anticipation. Well, I don't know, I said, my voice hoarse. I either nailed it or committed career suicide. My phone buzzed, a text from Captain Rhodes. It contained no words, just a single emoji, a helicopter. The Rhodes application was Leo and Maya's fault. The packet sat on my desk for weeks, a monument to my own ambivalence. The deadline was in 2 days. It's intellectual cowardice not to apply, Maya said, perched on the edge of my dorm room desk. She'd become a fixture here, our debates shifting from the seminar room to this cluttered space, her principled skepticism now a sharpening tool rather than a barrier. It's not cowardice, it's realism, I argued, though it felt weak. Finch is one of the recommenders. He'll damn me with faint praise if he agrees at all. And the essay, they want a personal statement. What do I write? Please send the ROTC kid to Oxford so he can learn why his chosen profession is intellectually bankrupt. Leo looked up from his biology textbook. Write what you actually believe. You've been doing that all semester. You got an A for it, remember? And Finch's quote is famous in that little poli-sci pond. Address it head-on, turn it into a strength. Maya nodded, her eyes alight with the challenge. He's right. Your entire thesis is about integration. The essay is just a more personal version of that. Explain why someone who believes in the life of the mind would also choose the discipline of the military. It's the perfect narrative. They eat that stuff up. I stared at the blank document on my screen. The cursor blinked, a metronome of doubt. I thought of the Apache slot, secured now, a tangible future. This was ephemeral, arrogant. But the doubt, as always, curdled into fuel. Why not? The worst they could say was no. The worst Finch could do was confirm his own bias. I had nothing to lose but my own hesitation. I wrote through the night. I wrote about my father's hands, grease-stained and capable, and the library that was my escape. I wrote about the visceral understanding of power I learned in a uniform and the abstract theories of power I studied in Finch's class. I wrote about the dissonance, not as a weakness, but as a necessary friction that generated a clearer light. I wrote about Captain Ray's teaching me that the most complex systems, whether an Apache's flight controls or a counterinsurgency campaign, required both intuitive skill and deep theoretical understanding. I wrote about the civil-military divide not as a chasm to be lamented, but as a space to be bridged by people willing to be fluent in both languages. And I addressed Finch's quote. I didn't attack him. I used him as a starting point. A professor of mine once defined a particular choice as one between cultivating a mind and following orders. I am applying for the Rhodes Scholarship because I reject that dichotomy as a false one. The most rigorous discipline I have ever encountered has been in the pursuit of becoming an Army officer, a process that demands not the suspension of critical thought, but its relentless application under pressure. I seek to study at Oxford not to escape my commitment to service, but to deepen its intellectual foundation so that one day, the orders I give or follow are informed by the very best of human thought. I hit submit an hour before the deadline, a mix of nausea and defiance churning in my gut. The interview invitation came a month later. It was a video call with the district committee. I wore a coat and tie, the uniform deliberately left in the closet. The committee was polite, probing, their questions wide-ranging. Then the chair, a former ambassador, adjusted her glasses. Mr. Jameson, your essay is compelling. You reference a professor's stark view of the military. Were you not concerned that pursuing a commission would, in his words, atrophy the very faculties you wish to cultivate? This was it. I felt a strange calm descend, the same focused clarity I'd felt in the Apache board. No, ma'am, I was, because I found the opposite to be true. The academy teaches you to think in ideal conditions. The military, at its best, teaches you to think when it matters most, when lives, including your own, are on the line. It demands intellectual courage of a different, applied kind. My professor's perspective assumes theory is the pinnacle of intellectual endeavor. I believe theory untested by practice is just speculation. I want to bring the rigor of practice back to the world of theory. I couldn't read their faces. The interview ended with courteous thank yous. As the screen went black, I exhaled a breath I felt I'd been holding for 4 years. The thesis defense was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in the main political science lecture hall. My topic, the soldier scholar, reclaiming the moral agency of the profession of arms from Machiavelli to modernity. It was the full synthesis, weaving together the philosophy I'd studied with the practical doctrine I'd lived. The room was far fuller than I'd expected. Leo sat in the front row, giving me a subtle thumbs up. Maya was beside him, her notebook open. And in the back, near the door, Captain Ray's stood, out of uniform but unmistakable in her posture, arms crossed, observing. My committee sat at a table to the side, 2 supportive professors, and in the center, presiding, Professor Alastair Finch. I began my presentation, my voice filling the space. I spoke of the Renaissance condottieri, of the Enlightenment's creation of the citizen soldier, of the dangerous modern drift toward a military scene as a mindless instrument. I cited my own experiences in ROTC field exercises, the constant ethical drills, Captain Ray's Socratic grilling after every training mission. I argued that the true safeguard of democracy was not a military subservient to politics, but one engaged in a constant, informed dialogue with it, a profession built on educated judgment, not blind obedience. The questions from my other committee members were challenging but constructive. Then Finch cleared his throat. The room stilled. An ambitious synthesis, Mr. Jameson, he began, his voice dripping with that familiar, weary condescension. You weave your threads quite deftly, but I must return to the fundamental and I believe fatal flaw in your premise. He leaned forward, his eyes cold behind his spectacles. You speak of dialogue, of judgment, yet the institution you are about to enter is a hierarchy. Its currency is the order. You have constructed an elegant intellectual framework, but does it not ultimately serve as a sophisticated justification for choosing obedience over independent thought? A way to console yourself that following orders is, in fact, a profound intellectual act. It was the question, laid bare, stripped of academic pretense. A hot spike of anger flashed through me, but I clamped down on it. I saw Leo tense. Maya had stopped writing. I didn't look at Ray's. I took a sip of water, buying a second to let the heat dissipate into something harder, sharper. I placed the glass down deliberately. Professor Finch, with respect, that is a profound misreading, both of my work and of the profession. My voice was low, clear, and carried to the back of the silent hall. You conflate independence with insubordination. You equate discipline with atrophy. It is a classic error of the observer who has never been inside the system he critiques. Finch's lips thinned. I critique from the tradition of reasoned distance, Mr. Jameson, not from within the echo chamber. The echo chamber, I repeated softly. Then I looked directly at him. Let's examine the premises. You assume the military mind is a blank slate upon which orders are written. My experience and the historical record shows it is a mind rigorously trained in a specific methodology, the application of violence or the threat of it in service of policy. That methodology requires understanding the policy. It requires wrestling with its moral dimensions. Captain Rhodes didn't teach me to switch off my brain. She taught me to calibrate it to a different set of priorities, where the cost of error is measured in human lives, not letter grades. I could feel the room holding its breath. I continued, methodical, cold. I was dismantling a faulty argument, not attacking a man. You cite autonomy as the highest intellectual good. I would argue that responsibility is a higher one. The autonomy of the scholar is, in many ways, a luxury. The responsibility of the officer is a burden. One is not inherently superior to the other. They are different forms of engagement with the world. My thesis argues for a reintegration of those forms. You dismiss this as justification because your starting axiom is that the military realm is inherently devoid of intellectual worth. That is not a conclusion you have reached through this dialogue today. It is the bias you brought into this room. Finch's face was pale now, a flush creeping up his neck. He was being challenged, not by passion, but by a more rigorous logic in his own temple. I am not choosing obedience over independent thought, I said, my final words falling like stones. I am striving to make my obedience thoughtful and my thought accountable. You assume the mind cannot be both disciplined and free. I am here to prove that false. The silence that followed was absolute and heavy. It was broken only by the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. Finch stared at me, his usual arsenal of dismissive phrases seemingly failing him. He looked, for the first time I had ever seen, intellectually cornered, not by emotion, but by the very rigor he claimed to champion. One of my other committee members, Professor Liang, gently stepped in. Thank you, Carter, a robust defense indeed. The formalities concluded shortly after. As the room began to murmur and people stood to leave, I felt a hollowed-out calm. Leo clapped me on the shoulder, his face split by a huge grin. You eviscerated him. Beautifully. Clinically, I think I need a cigarette and I don't even smoke. Maya's eyes were wide, impressed. You didn't just defend your thesis, you defended a whole way of being. I looked toward the back of the room. Captain Rhodes was still there. She didn't smile, she rarely did. But she gave me a single, slow nod. It was an artillery spotter's nod. Target destroyed. Finch gathered his papers without looking at me. As he passed, he paused for a fraction of a second. He didn't offer congratulations. He didn't acknowledge the defeat. He simply said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, "You will have to live that proof, Mr. Jameson, every day." It wasn't a blessing. It was a statement of fact and perhaps the barest acknowledgement of the challenge. Then he walked out. I stood in the emptying lecture hall, the late afternoon sun painting long stripes across the worn floor. The two futures I had been chasing, the Apache waiting on a tarmac somewhere, the spires of Oxford a distant dream, no longer felt like divergent paths. They felt like different terrains on the same map. The doubt that had been my constant companion for 4 years was still there, but its texture had changed. It was no longer a corrosive whisper, but the steady hum of an engine, a source of power. I had spoken my synthesis aloud, in the one place that had most doubted its possibility. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, I believed them completely. The silence in the lecture hall felt different from any I'd known. It wasn't the brittle quiet of Finch's seminar, nor the focused hush of a pre-flight briefing. This was the silence of 100 people leaning forward, listening. The air in the Woodrow Wilson Center's auditorium was cool, carrying the faint scent of old books and polished wood. I adjusted the microphone, my fingers brushing the stiff wool of my Army service uniform. The pilot wings above my left breast pocket were still new enough to feel like a secret. The ethical framework, I said, my voice steady in the amplified quiet, cannot be an afterthought baked into the software update. It must be the foundation upon which the entire system of human-machine collaboration is built. We are not asking the machine to make the moral choice for us. We are asking it to present the human operator with the clearest possible understanding of the consequences of each available choice. My research slides were clean, academic. Graphs of civilian casualty correlations with sensor fidelity. Philosophical excerpts from just war theory juxtaposed with declassified after-action reports. But the heart of the presentation, the part that made the senior fellows and policy advisors in the front row stop checking their phones, was the synthesis. It was the application of Oxford's relentless theoretical rigor to the visceral, pixelated reality I'd trained for in a simulator. I spoke about the cognitive wedge, the dangerous sliver of time and ambiguity where a remote operator, divorced from the sensory reality of the battlefield, could make a decision a pilot on station would hesitate to make. I argued for a hybrid model, where advanced drones operated not in isolation, but as extensions of manned platforms like the Apache, their data funneled to a crew who still breathed the dust and felt the weight of the decision in their gut. It is the embodiment of the decision that grounds its morality, I concluded, clicking to my final slide. A simple photograph of an Apache helicopter hovering against a desert sunset taken from my final qualification flight. A sensor feed is information. The smell of cordite, the vibration of the airframe, the presence of a fellow crewman sharing the same risk, that is context. Our policy must fight to preserve context, not eliminate it in the name of efficiency. The applause was polite, then deepened into something more substantial. A gray-haired man in a State Department pin nodded slowly. A woman from a Defense Ethics Institute began typing furiously. The moderator, a former ambassador, thanked me and opened the floor to questions. For 45 minutes they came. Sharp, nuanced, challenging. About international law, about AI accountability, about the politics of remote warfare. I answered, drawing on my political theory, my operational knowledge, the long debates I'd had with Maya over pints of bitter in Oxford pubs. I felt a strange, fluid calm. The two worlds, the one of lofty ideals and the one of brutal mechanics, were not at war inside me anymore. They were in conversation. After the last hand fell, I was surrounded. Business cards were pressed into my palm. A journalist asked for a follow-up. An Army colonel from the Pentagon clasped my shoulder. "Outstanding, Lieutenant. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need." I thanked him, the formality automatic, my mind already drifting to the reception in the atrium. The room was a murmur of clinking glasses and low conversation. I stood near a potted fern, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, feeling the pleasant exhaustion of a performance given well. I was scanning the crowd for the colonel, who'd mentioned introducing me to someone from DARPA, when I saw him. Professor Alastair Finch stood near the cheese platter, looking adrift. He seemed smaller. Not just older, though the 2 years had deepened the lines on his face and turned more of his thinning hair a stark white. He seemed diminished, like a statue moved to the wrong plaza. He wore a tweed jacket that was too warm for the room, and he held a glass of white wine as if unsure what to do with it. His eyes met mine across the crowd, and for a second the old arrogance flickered, a reflex, before it guttered out into something hesitant, almost wary. He moved toward me. There was no avoiding it. "Lieutenant Jameson," he said. The title sounded foreign in his mouth. "Professor Finch, I didn't know you were consulting." "A temporary advisory role for a study group." He waved a vague hand. "Your presentation was surprisingly cogent." It was the same backhanded compliment, but the venom was gone. It was just a habit, an old rhetorical tick he no longer had the energy to fully commit to. "Thank you," I said, not taking the bait. He sipped his wine, his eyes dropping to the wings on my uniform, then to the Rhodes Scholar pin discreetly placed beside my name tag. The two emblems, side by side, seemed to short-circuit his usual categories. "Oxford has agreed with you, it seems," he said finally. It's been challenging, in the best way. And you are a pilot now. He said it not as a question, but as a statement of bewildering fact. Yes, sir, Apache helicopters. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting over my shoulder to the window, where Washington's evening lights were beginning to glow. I heard your answer to the question about Hannah Arendt and the banality of evil, linking it to interface design. It was inventive. There was a long pause. The noise of the reception swirled around us, a buffer of meaningless sound. I read your monograph in international security, he said, almost reluctantly. The one on Clausewitz and networked warfare. I was stunned he'd even known it existed. I'd be interested in your thoughts. He gave a small, tired shrug. It was adequately researched. It lacked a certain philosophical purity, but it engaged with the material world in a way most graduate students fear too. He looked back at me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw not the antagonist of my undergraduate years, but just an old scholar, his certainty eroded by time and a changing world he no longer dominated. Congratulations, Carter, on all of it. He said my first name. He'd never done that before. It wasn't warm, it was an admission. Then he gave a slight, stiff nod and melted back into the crowd, heading for the exit, his tweed jacket a lonely splash of anachronistic brown. I stood there, my sparkling water going flat. The encounter left no scar, no simmering anger. It just was a data point, the final, faint echo of a question that had long since been answered elsewhere. Later, in my sterile hotel room, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound, I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. The conversation with Finch replayed, but it was overshadowed by a sharper, more visceral memory, the one his comment about being a pilot had triggered. 2 months ago, Fort Rucker, Alabama, the final qualification flight for the Apache. The cockpit was a claustrophobic symphony of light and data. The helmet weighed heavy on my shoulders, the monocle over my right eye painting the world in shades of green and white. I was in the front seat, the pilot in command. Behind me in the gunner's station was my instructor, Chief Warrant Officer 4 Haskins, a man of few words and impossible standards. Dust Bowl 11, you are cleared into the working area. Winds 210 at 10. Report tally on target. The target was a mock convoy of old truck husks in a vast, sandy clearing. The scenario was a complex ambush, pop-up threats, rules of engagement shifting mid-flow simulated civilians in the area. It was the practical, physical exam to the theoretical one I'd faced before the board 2 years prior. We came in low, nap of the earth, the thrum of the rotors a vibration in my bones. The scent of jet fuel and hot electronics was familiar, comforting. The aircraft was an extension of my body, the cyclic between my knees, the collective in my left hand, not tools but nerves. Tally, 3 vehicles, 10 o'clock. Scan west, look for the secondary. Haskins's voice was calm in my headset. I nudged the pedals, swinging the bird's nose, my eyes flicking between the canopy, the monocle's display, and the multifunction screens. The world was a flood of information, airspeed, torque, threat warnings, navigation points. My mind didn't race, it settled. It filtered. The political theory was there, a silent framework, proportionality, distinction. The muscle memory was there, smooth control inputs, systematic scan. They weren't competing. One was the why, the other was the how. They had to work together, or the whole thing fell apart. The secondary target popped up, a simulated anti-aircraft gun. A warning blared in the cockpit. Missile launch, brake left, now. I didn't think, I acted. Collective down, cyclic left, pedal. The Apache dropped and banked hard, the G-force pressing me into the seat. My eyes stayed locked on the threat, my fingers toggling countermeasures. The flare canisters fired with a thump I felt in my chest. The simulated missile streak passed harmlessly behind us. Good, now re-engage the primary. They're scattering. For the next 20 minutes, it was a dance of brutal precision, making split-second decisions with Haskins's calm voice confirming or correcting, juggling the physics of flight with the ethics of engagement. At one point, a dummy marked with orange, a civilian, appeared near a truck. I called it, held fire, adjusted my approach angle to isolate the valid target. It wasn't a heroic moral stand. It was procedure. It was the system I had argued for in the lecture hall, made real in sweat and vibration and focused breath. Back on the ground, after the engines whined down to silence, Haskins climbed out of the back and came around to my side. He pulled off his helmet. His face was grim, as always. He looked at me for a long moment, then at the aircraft, then back at me. He gave a single, slow nod. "You handle the bird, Lieutenant. Paperwork's on your desk." That was it. I was qualified. Lying in the hotel bed, I understood. Finch's hesitant congratulations, his acknowledgement, was not the victory. The victory was the nod from Haskins. The victory was the fluid calm in the cockpit when the missile warning flashed. The victory was standing in that auditorium and feeling the theory and the practice weave together into a single, strong thread. His opinion was a footnote now, in a thesis I was writing with my life. The next morning, I rented a car and drove south, out of the D.C. sprawl, through the long, pine-flanked highways to Alabama. The air grew thick and warm. By the time I pulled through the gates of Fort Rucker, the familiar humidity was a blanket, the smell of cut grass and aviation fuel a homecoming. Major Sophia Reyes' office was in a new building, but it was the same organized clutter. Maps on the wall, a model Apache on a shelf, a coffee mug that read danger, napping pilot. She looked up from a stack of training manuals as I appeared in her doorway. A faint smile touched her lips. "Lieutenant Jameson, I heard you gave the think tanker something to chew on." "Tried to, ma'am." She came around the desk. She didn't offer a handshake. She assessed me, her pilot's eyes missing nothing. "The uniform fits. So does the Oxford accent, I bet." "No accent, ma'am. Just a deeper appreciation for the coffee here." That earned a real smile. "Come on, I need caffeine." We walked to the small O Club, not speaking much. The ease of shared understanding made words redundant. We got coffee and took a table by the window overlooking the flight line. An Apache sat on the tarmac, its rotors drooping, a crew chief performing a careful inspection. "So," she said, stirring her coffee, "the dreaming spires, you solving the world's problems between rowing practice and fancy dinners." I told her about the tutorials, the debates, the strange beauty of arguing about the metaphysics of war in a 14th century dining hall. I told her about the relentless reading, the feeling of my mind being stretched in directions I didn't know existed. She listened, nodding occasionally, and the flying. I described the qualification flight, the missile break, the civilian dummy, Haskins's nod. She sipped her coffee, watching the activity on the flight line. "Good, you need both. The world's full of pilots who can't think past their fuel gauges and thinkers who wouldn't know which end of a helicopter to kick." "I wanted to thank you, Major," I said, the words feeling both necessary and inadequate, "for seeing it before I could." She waved it off, but her eyes were softer than her gesture. "I didn't see anything you didn't put there. I just pointed at the obvious." She looked at me directly. "You had to do the work. You had to pass Finch's tests and the Army's tests and your own. All I did was tell you they were the same test." We sat in silence for a moment. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Leo, now a perpetually exhausted but cheerful med student in Cleveland, just diagnosed a guy with a case of the Mondays. Prescribed 2 beers and a nap. "How's the policy nerd life?" I showed it to Reyes. She snorted. "He still owes me 20 push-ups for that comment about my haircut in 19. Another buzz. This one from Maya, a photo of her buried in law books at Georgetown, a sticky note on one that read Veterans Procedural Reform Draft. The caption, "Using the tools of the master to dismantle the house or at least get the plumbing fixed. Your lecture notes saved me. Drink soon." I put the phone down. On the tarmac, the crew chief finished his work and gave the Apache a pat, like it was a loyal horse. "What about the next group?" I asked Reyes. "Any like me?" She considered. "A few. One kid's a philosophy major from some liberal arts school. Spends his first week trying to deconstruct the chain of command. I've got him cleaning latrines with a toothbrush. He'll either quit or become the best officer we've got." She finished her coffee. "The synthesis you talked about, it's not a destination. It's a constant recalibration. You'll have to keep proving it to them and to yourself, every flight, every paper." "I know," I said. She stood up. "Good, then my work here is done." She started to walk away, then paused, turning back. Her voice was matter-of-fact, the same tone she'd used to tell me my navigation was off by 3 meters. "You handled it, Carter." Then she was gone, back to her office, back to the endless work of shaping the next generation. I stayed at the table, finishing my coffee. Through the window, I watched the afternoon sun glint off the Apache's canopy. In my mind's eye, I saw the dense, black text of my Oxford thesis on the screen of my laptop, the vibration of the aircraft, the weight of the book, the G-force of the brake, the quiet of the library. The convergence wasn't a dramatic collision. It was this quiet moment of simultaneous awareness. The feel of the coffee mug in my hand, rough ceramic. The distant whine of a turbine engine starting up. The memory of Finch's bewildered face. The alert chime of a new text, probably Leo with another terrible joke. I was Lieutenant Carter Jameson, U.S. Army Apache pilot. I was Carter Jameson, Rhodes Scholar academic. These were not masks I switched between. They were the same face, seen from different angles. The discipline from the flight line focused my research. The intellectual breadth from Oxford deepened my understanding of my duty. The doubt that had once been a grinding stone was now a tuning fork, a slight hum that kept everything in alignment. I stood, left the club, and walked out onto the tarmac, keeping a respectful distance from the aircraft. The heat rose in shimmering waves. I looked at the Apache, then down at my own hands. They were the hands that could dissect a philosophical paradox for hours, and the hands that could execute a perfect hovering turn in a $30 million machine. There was no fanfare, no trophy, just the sun on my neck, the smell of hot asphalt and jet fuel, and the solid, unshakable knowledge that the path I was on was my own. It was carved not from defiance or blind obedience, but from a hard-won integration. The boy from Ohio, the student, the cadet, the scholar, the pilot, all those threads were now plied into a single, strong cord. It was enough. It was everything.